A bobcat rescue that defied science, then changed two broken lives forever. Deep within Oregon's Cascade Range, where towering Douglas firs brushed against an endless gray sky and the wind moved through the canopy and low, mournful whispers. Professor Elias Thorne lived a life measured in careful increments. At 72, he had become a man of rigid routines and calculated movements, his days unfolding with the predictable rhythm of a metronome. He ran the Evergreen Haven Wildlife Care Center with the same methodical precision he had once applied to his university lectures, before retirement had transformed him from an academic into something else entirely, though he could never quite name what that something was. His cabin stood at the forest's edge, a modest structure of weathered cedar that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Inside, silence pressed against the walls like a living thing, broken only by the occasional snap and hiss of logs burning in the stone fireplace, or the relentless ticking of an antique clock that had belonged to his grandfather. The clock's brass face caught the firelight in the evenings, casting dancing shadows across shelves lined with scientific journals and field guides. Their spines cracked and faded from years of use. Professor Thorne would sit in his worn leather chair, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, staring into the flames as if they might reveal some answer to questions he refused to articulate. It had been 10 years since Margaret died, 10 years since the morning he woke to find her still and cold beside him, her hand resting on the quilt she had spent the previous autumn stitching together from scraps of fabric that held their history, pieces of her wedding dress, his old flannel shirts, the curtains from their first apartment. He had folded that quilt carefully and placed it in a cedar chest at the foot of his bed, and he had not opened the chest since. In the decade that followed, Professor Thorne had constructed around himself a fortress of work and routine, of scientific protocols and empirical data, anything that could be measured and cataloged and controlled. Grief, he discovered, could be managed if one simply refused to acknowledge it, if one buried it beneath layers of professional obligation and intellectual rigor. The Evergreen Haven Wildlife Care Center had become his entire world. He arrived before dawn each morning, checking on the animals in their various stages of rehabilitation, reviewing medical charts with the same intensity he had once reserved for peer-reviewed research papers. He spoke to his small staff in clipped, professional tones, offering praise sparingly and criticism with surgical precision. The animals were not pets, he reminded everyone constantly. They were wild creatures temporarily under human care, and the goal was always to minimize human contact, to preserve their wildness, to return them to their natural habitat as quickly as possible. Attachment was the enemy of good rehabilitation. Emotion clouded judgment. These were his unshakable principles, the pillars upon which he had built his carefully ordered existence. The winter that changed everything arrived with unusual ferocity. Snow began falling in early November and continued through December, accumulating in deep drifts that transformed the forest into a silent white cathedral. The Douglas firs stood like frozen sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, and the narrow road leading to Evergreen Haven became nearly impassable. Professor Thorne had always loved winter for its austerity, its reduction of the world to essential elements. But this particular winter felt different somehow, heavier, as if the snow carried within it the weight of all the things he had refused to feel. It was on a bitter afternoon in mid-December when the call came from the Forest Service. A lynx had been found in a trap, illegal of course, left by poachers who cared nothing for conservation laws or the suffering of wild creatures. The animal was badly injured, they said, possibly beyond saving, but they were bringing him in anyway. Professor Thorne prepared the surgical suite with practiced efficiency, laying out instruments in precise rows, adjusting the lights, checking the anesthesia equipment twice because he always checked everything twice. When they carried the lynx in on a stretcher, Professor Thorne felt something shift in his chest, a small movement like a stone settling at the bottom of a deep well. The animal was magnificent despite his injuries. A mature male with sandy gold fur mottled with dark brown spots, his body muscular and powerful even in its damaged state. But it was the eyes that stopped Professor Thorne mid-step. Golden eyes that held not just pain, but something else. Something that looked disturbingly like human sorrow, like comprehension of loss that went beyond mere physical injury. The surgery took 4 hours. Professor Thorne worked with absolute concentration, his hands steady as he repaired torn ligaments, set broken bones, cleaned and sutured the savage wound where the trap had nearly severed the lynx's hind leg. Dr. Ilara Vance, the young veterinarian he had hired 6 months earlier, assisted with quiet competence, anticipating his needs before he could voice them. Her dark eyes focused intently on the work. When they finally finished and the lynx lay sedated in the recovery room, Professor Thorne stripped off his surgical gloves and stood for a long moment staring down at the animal. "Will he make it?" Ilara asked softly. "Physically, the prognosis is good." Professor Thorne replied, his voice flat and clinical. "The leg will heal, whether he can survive in the wild again. Whether he can hunt effectively, that remains to be seen." "I meant emotionally, Pilamon," Ilara said, and Professor Thorne turned to look at her, surprised by the comment. She met his gaze steadily. "You saw his eyes. That wasn't just physical pain. Animals don't experience emotions the way humans do," Professor Thorne said, the words automatic, something he had said countless times before. "We must be careful not to anthropomorphize." Ilara smiled slightly, a smile that suggested she heard what he was saying but disagreed entirely. "Of course, Professor," she said, and left him alone with the sleeping lynx. In the days that followed, the lynx, whom the staff began calling Coda after Sam Miller, the center's facilities manager, suggested it, proved to be a difficult patient. He was aggressive when anyone approached, growling low in his throat, his golden eyes tracking every movement with fierce intensity. He refused to eat for the first 3 days, and when he finally did begin eating, he would only accept food if it was left outside his enclosure and everyone retreated out of sight. At night, Professor Thorne would hear him from his cabin, long, mournful vocalizations that carried through the cold air and settled into his bones like frost. "He's calling for his family," Ilara said one morning, standing beside Professor Thorne as they observed Coda through the observation window. The lynx paced his enclosure restlessly, favoring his injured leg but moving with surprising grace despite the obvious pain. The ranger said they found signs of a mate and cubs in the area where he was trapped. "They're probably dead by now, without him to help hunt." Professor Thorne said nothing. He had read the ranger's report, had noted the tracks in the snow, the small den site, the evidence of recent habitation. He had filed this information away as relevant data, contextual background that might inform the rehabilitation process. But he had not allowed himself to think about what it meant, about a male lynx fighting desperately to return to his family while slowly dying in a trap, about cubs waiting for a father who would never come. "We should minimize observation," he said finally. "The more we watch him, the more stressed he becomes. Standard protocol for wild felids." "Yes, Professor," Ilara said, but he could hear the doubt in her voice. The winter deepened. Christmas came and went unmarked at Evergreen Haven. Professor Thorne spent the day reviewing charts and updating their database, treating it like any other day because that was easier than remembering other Christmases. Margaret decorating their small tree with ornaments collected over 40 years of marriage, the smell of cinnamon and pine, her laughter as she tried to convince him to wear the ridiculous reindeer sweater her sister had knitted. It was 2 days after Christmas when Ilara arrived at work before dawn, even earlier than Professor Thorne, and discovered something at the gate. The motion sensors had been triggered, but when she checked the security footage, she saw no sign of a vehicle, no person approaching. Instead, she found a cardboard box, its flaps folded closed, sitting just inside the fence line. The box was moving slightly, and from inside came a sound so faint she almost missed it. A tiny mewling cry that made her heart clench. She opened the box carefully, and there, nestled in a ratty towel, was a kitten. Not a lynx kitten or a bobcat, but a domestic kitten, pure white with enormous blue eyes, so small she could fit in Ilara's palm. The kitten was soaked through, shivering violently, her breathing rapid and shallow. Someone had abandoned her here, perhaps thinking a wildlife center might take her in, not understanding that Evergreen Haven had no facilities for domestic animals. No mandate to care for anything except native wildlife. Alara should have called animal control. That was protocol. But the kitten was dying. She could see that clearly. And animal control wouldn't arrive for hours. Not in this snow, not this far out. She made a decision in that moment that would alter the course of many lives. She brought the kitten inside, wrapped her in warm towels, placed her in one of the small incubators used for orphaned wildlife, and began trying to save her life. Professor Thorne arrived an hour later to find Alara in the intensive care room, feeding the kitten with an eyedropper, one careful drop at a time. His face darkened immediately. "What is that doing here?" he demanded. "Someone left her at the gate," Alara said, not looking up from her work. "She was dying. This is a wildlife rehabilitation center. Dr. Vance, not an animal shelter. We have neither the resources nor the legal mandate to care for domestic animals. You know this. I couldn't just let her die, Professor. Call animal control. They'll send someone. In this snow, that could take days. She might not last another hour." Professor Thorne stood rigid in the doorway, his jaw tight. Everything in him wanted to enforce the rules, to maintain the boundaries he had established, to prevent this small breach in protocol from becoming something larger. But Alara's hands were so gentle as she fed the kitten, and the tiny creature was struggling so hard to live, her small chest rising and falling with each labored breath, and somewhere deep in the fortress he had built, something cracked. 24 hours, he said finally. "Keep her stable for 24 hours. Then she goes to animal control, regardless of the weather, and she stays isolated. I don't want any cross-contamination with the wildlife." "Yes, Professor," Alara said, and this time he heard the gratitude in her voice. She named the kitten Luna, after the moon that had been impossibly bright the night before, casting silver light across the snow-covered forest. For 3 days, Luna hovered between life and death. Alara stayed with her around the clock, sleeping in fits on the small couch in the observation room, waking every few hours to feed her, to check her temperature, to whisper encouragement to a creature that probably couldn't understand words, but might somehow sense care and determination, and the stubborn refusal to let go. On the 4th day, something strange happened. Lily Chen, the newest member of their small staff, was making her morning rounds when she noticed Coda behaving oddly. The lynx was standing at the front of his enclosure, pressed against the heavy steel mesh, his golden eyes fixed on something with an intensity Lily had never seen before. She followed his gaze and realized he was staring at the intensive care room, at the small incubator where Luna lay. Barely visible through the observation window, Lily watched, fascinated, as Coda made a sound she had never heard from him, a soft, rhythmic churring that seemed to vibrate from deep in his chest. It was not aggressive, not a growl or a snarl, but something else entirely, something almost tender. She documented the behavior in her notes, uncertain what it meant, but certain it was significant. When she mentioned it to Alara, the younger veterinarian immediately went to observe. Sure enough, whenever anyone approached Luna's incubator, Coda would pace back and forth in his enclosure, his ears flat against his head, his churring sound becoming more insistent, almost protective. Professor Thorne dismissed the observation initially as coincidence, perhaps a reaction to the increased human activity around the intensive care room, nothing more than territorial behavior magnified by the stress of captivity. But Alara and Lily continued to document Coda's responses, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. The lynx was not reacting to human presence in general. He was reacting specifically to Luna's presence, to her location, to any perceived threat to the tiny white kitten he could barely see through layers of glass and steel mesh. "It's not scientifically possible," so Professor Thorne insisted during a staff meeting, his voice carrying the edge of frustration that came from confronting data that contradicted his understanding of the natural world. Lynxes are solitary predators. They have no evolved capacity for cross-species bonding, particularly not with potential prey animals. What you're observing is likely a stress response, possibly triggered by auditory frequencies in the kitten's vocalizations that mimic lynx kitten distress calls. "With respect, Professor," Alara said quietly, "I think we should at least consider the possibility that something else is happening here, such as grief recognition. such as a widowed father recognizing something in Luna that reminds him of what he lost. The words hung in the air between them. Professor Thorne felt his chest tighten, felt the carefully constructed walls around his emotions strain against sudden pressure. He stood abruptly, gathering his papers with sharp, angry movements. "That's anthropomorphization at its most extreme," he said coldly. "We deal in observable facts here, not sentimental projections. I expect better from my staff." He left the room before anyone could respond, before he had to see the hurt flash across Ilara's face, before his own carefully maintained composure could crack any further. In his office, he sat at his desk and pressed his palms against his eyes, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Luna continued to improve, slowly but steadily. By the end of her first week at Evergreen Haven, she was eating on her own, her breathing had normalized, and she had begun to display the playful curiosity natural to kittens. Alara had set up a small recovery pen for her in the intensive care room, and Luna would tumble around inside it, batting at toys, pouncing on her own tail, her blue eyes bright with the simple joy of being alive. And Coda watched, every day, for hours at a time. The old lynx would position himself at the front of his enclosure, his golden eyes fixed on Luna with an intensity that seemed to transcend mere animal curiosity. When Luna played, Coda's ears would prick forward, tracking her movements. When Luna slept, Coda would settle onto his haunches, still watching. A silent guardian maintaining vigil over something he could not reach and perhaps did not fully understand. The night the blizzard struck, it came with a fury that shocked even those accustomed to harsh mountain winters. The wind screamed through the forest with a sound like tearing metal, and snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to nothing within minutes. Professor Thorne was in his cabin when the power failed, the lights flickering once, twice, then dying completely, leaving him in darkness broken only by the glow of the fireplace. He grabbed his emergency kit and flashlight and fought his way through waist-deep snow to the center. Arriving to find Alara and Sam already there, their faces tight with worry in the beam of their flashlights. "Generator won't start," Sam reported, his breath fogging in the rapidly cooling air. "Fuel line's frozen solid. I'm working on it, but it could take hours." "Temperature's dropping fast," Alara added. "The animals are okay for now. They're adapted to cold. But Luna, she didn't need to finish. Luna was a domestic kitten, bred for generations to live in human homes, to sleep on warm couches and eat from ceramic bowls. She had no defenses against the kind of cold that was already seeping through the walls, turning their breath to ice crystals, making the metal equipment painful to touch even through gloves. They found Luna in her incubator, the temperature inside dropping degree by degree despite the insulated walls. She was curled into the tightest ball possible, her small body shaking with violent shivers, her breathing rapid and panicked. Alara wrapped her in heated blankets from the emergency supply, but without power, the blankets would cool quickly, and there were only so many of them. "We need to move her somewhere warmer," Lily said, hugging herself against the cold. "Maybe Professor Thorne's cabin. The fireplace is still working." "Too far in this storm," Sam said, shaking his head. "We'd never make it. Visibility's zero and the snow's still coming down hard." Professor Thorne stood silent, his mind racing through options and finding each one inadequate. They could try to warm the entire intensive care room with portable heaters, but those ran on propane and their supply was limited, needed for the surgical suite in case of emergencies. They could attempt to transport Luna through the storm, but Sam was right. The risk of exposure was too great. "They could Coda," Alara said suddenly, and everyone turned to look at her. She was staring at the wall that separated the intensive care room from the large animal enclosures, her expression intense with desperate inspiration. "Coda's enclosure is insulated, designed to maintain temperature even without power. And he's a large mammal, generating significant body heat. If we put Luna's incubator near him—" "Absolutely not," Professor Thorne interrupted, his voice sharp. "That's incredibly dangerous. Coda is a wild predator, stressed and unpredictable, even with the barrier between them. The proximity could trigger an attack response. And if something went wrong, if the enclosure barrier failed somehow—" Luna would be killed instantly. She's going to die anyway if we don't do something, Alara shot back, her usual deference giving way to fierce determination. You've seen how he reacts to her. He's protective, not aggressive. This could work. You're basing a life or death decision on behavioral observations that could be completely misinterpreted. That's not science, Dervance. That's wishful thinking. Then what do you suggest? Alara demanded. And Professor Thorne had no answer. No brilliant solution derived from decades of experience and careful study. Nothing except the growing certainty that this tiny kitten was going to, while he stood here arguing about protocol and proper scientific methodology. In the end, it was not a rational decision, but a surrender to necessity and perhaps something deeper, something he could not name. They moved Luna's incubator carefully through the darkened corridors, their flashlight beams cutting through shadows that seemed to press in from all sides. Coda heard them coming, his low growl rumbling through the walls. But when they entered his space and he saw what they carried, the growl transformed into that strange churring sound, urgent now, almost questioning. They placed the incubator as close to Coda's enclosure as safety would allow, perhaps 3 feet from the heavy steel mesh. Inside, Luna's shivering had intensified, her small body racked with tremors that seemed likely to shake her apart. Coda pressed himself against the mesh immediately, his large body radiating heat that could be felt even from several feet away. His golden eyes locked on the kitten with fierce focus. "This is insane, Cheyenne," Professor Thorne muttered, but he made no move to reverse the decision. "Someone needs to stay here, monitor the situation constantly. If there's any sign of aggression, any indication that Coda is becoming agitated, we remove Luna immediately." "I'll stay," Alara volunteered. "We'll both stay," Professor Thorne corrected, surprising himself with the words. "Lily, Sam, try to get some rest in the break room. We'll need you fresh if the generator situation becomes more complicated." The long night that followed would remain etched in Professor Thorne's memory with a clarity that defied the passage of time. He and Alara sat in the observation area, wrapped in emergency blankets, watching through the dim glow of battery-powered lanterns as Coda maintained his vigil over Luna. The lynx never moved from his position against the mesh. His body curved around the incubator as much as the barrier would allow, and gradually, impossibly, Luna's shivering began to ease. Her breathing slowed, deepened, and after perhaps 2 hours, she uncurled slightly, one tiny white paw stretching out as if reaching toward the source of warmth and safety she could sense but not see. Coda responded by pressing even closer to the mesh, and from deep in his chest came a continuous purring sound. Not quite like a domestic cat's purr, but similar, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to fill the space around them. Professor Thorne had read about this behavior in academic journals, had seen it mentioned in field studies of wild felids, but he had never witnessed it, had never understood that such a sound could carry within it something that felt unmistakably like love. "He lost his family," Alara said softly, breaking the silence they had maintained for hours. "But now he's found someone to protect again." Professor Thorne wanted to argue, wanted to retreat into scientific explanations about thermoregulation and acoustic phenomena, but the words would not come. Instead, he found himself thinking about Margaret, about the morning she died, about how he had held her hand and felt the warmth leaving her body degree by degree while dawn light crept across their bedroom floor. He had not cried then, had not cried at the funeral, had not cried once in the 10 years since, because crying meant acknowledging the loss, and acknowledging the loss meant feeling it, and feeling it meant drowning in an ocean of grief he did not believe he could survive. "I had a wife," he heard himself say, the words emerging without conscious intention. "Margaret. She died 10 years ago, suddenly, a stroke in her sleep. We were supposed to have more time. We had plans, places we wanted to visit, things we wanted to do. And then one morning she was just gone, and I didn't know how to continue existing in a world where she didn't." Alara turned to look at him, her young face soft with compassion in the lantern light. She said nothing, simply listened, and somehow her silence gave him permission to continue. "I thought if I just kept working, kept following the rules and protocols and scientific methods, I could manage. I could build a life around the work, around helping these animals, and that would be enough. But it wasn't grief management. It was grief avoidance. And watching Coda now, seeing him reach out toward this kitten despite everything evolution should tell him not to, despite the pain and the loss he's experienced, I realize he's braver than I've been. He's willing to risk caring again. It's never too late to start caring again. Professor, Alara said gently, for Coda, for you. The blizzard raged through the night, but inside Coda's enclosure, Luna slept peacefully, her small body warm and safe, guarded by a fierce protector who had somehow found in her a reason to heal. When dawn finally broke, pale winter light filtering through snow-covered windows, Sam managed to get the generator running, and warmth began flowing through the center again. But no one suggested moving Luna back to the intensive care room. The evidence of what had occurred was undeniable. The kitten had survived because of Coda, and Coda, for the first time since his arrival, seemed at peace. In the weeks that followed, Professor Thorne found himself spending hours observing the growing bond between lynx and kitten. Luna, now thriving and increasingly confident, would press herself against the mesh from her side, and Coda would gently touch his nose to hers through the barrier, or carefully lick her white fur with his rough tongue, the same grooming behavior he would have shown his own cubs. When Luna played, attacking toy mice with fierce kitten determination, Coda would watch with his ears pricked forward, his tail twitching in what any cat owner would recognize as amusement. At night, they would sleep pressed against opposite sides of the mesh, their breathing synchronized, two beings separated by steel but connected by something far stronger. Professor Thorne's relationship with Alara shifted as well. The rigid hierarchy of senior professor and junior veterinarian softening into something more collaborative, more collegial. He began asking for her observations rather than dismissing them, began considering emotional welfare alongside physical health, began acknowledging that the heart had wisdom the mind could not always grasp. Alara, in turn, absorbed his knowledge and experience, learning to balance compassion with professional boundaries, to recognize when intervention was necessary and when nature should be allowed to take its course. You've changed, Alara told him one morning as they stood together watching Coda and Luna. You're different than when I started here. Perhaps, Professor Thorne admitted, or perhaps I'm just returning to something I used to be, before I forgot that science and emotion are not mutually exclusive. The day came, as it inevitably must, when Coda's rehabilitation reached its conclusion. His leg had healed well, his strength had returned, and by every physical metric, he was ready for release back into the wild. Professor Thorne scheduled the release for a mild afternoon in early March, when the snow had begun to recede and the forest was slowly awakening from winter's grip. The protocol was standard. They would tranquilize Coda, transport him deep into the national forest, far from human habitation, and release him in an area with good prey populations and suitable denning sites. Sam prepared the tranquilizer dart, checked the dosage twice according to Coda's weight, and approached the enclosure with the air rifle. But something was wrong. Coda, who had become relatively calm in recent weeks, suddenly became agitated, pacing frantically, his ears flat against his skull, his golden eyes wild with what could only be described as panic. He growled, Jai, not the protective churr he used with Luna, but a warning, a desperate vocalization that made everyone present take an involuntary step backward. He knows, Lily whispered, her voice awed. Somehow he knows we're going to separate him from Luna. And at that moment, as if in response to Coda's distress, Luna's cry echoed from the intensive care room where they had moved her for the release procedure. It was a high, frightened sound, a kitten calling for the only parent figure she had ever truly known. And the effect on Coda was immediate and dramatic. He threw himself against the mesh with such force that the entire enclosure shuddered, his roars shaking the walls, his claws tearing at the steel with desperate strength. Stand down, Professor Thorne ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. Sam immediately lowered the air rifle, backing away from the enclosure. Everyone out, now. They retreated to the observation room, and gradually Coda's panic subsided, though he continued to pace, continued to vocalize, his distress palpable even through the reinforced walls. Luna's cries had softened to whimpers, but they could still be heard, a counterpoint to Coda's anguish that formed a symphony of separation and loss. Professor Thorne stood at the observation window for a long time, his hands gripped behind his back, his face unreadable. Finally, he turned to his staff, and there was something in his expression and they had never seen before, a kind of acceptance, a letting go of rigidity in favor of a deeper truth. "We're not releasing him," he said simply. "We can't." "Professor," Sam began, but Professor Thorne held up a hand. "I know what the protocols say. I know what standard procedure dictates, but we have to acknowledge what we're seeing here. And what we're seeing is a genuine, essential bond that transcends species boundaries. Coda has found in Luna a new purpose, a new family. He's healed not just physically, but emotionally, and that healing is dependent on her presence. To separate them now would be cruel, possibly devastating to both of them." "But where will they go?" Lily asked. "We can't keep them here indefinitely. This is a rehabilitation center, not a sanctuary." "No," Professor Thorne agreed, "but I know someone who runs a sanctuary. Let me make some calls." Eleanor Reed had been in the wildlife sanctuary business for 30 years, and in that time, she had seen almost everything the intersection of human compassion and animal welfare could produce. Her facility, the Serene Peak Eternal Preserve, occupied 200 acres of pristine forest in a remote valley of the Cascade Range, accessible only by a single winding road that was gated and carefully monitored. The preserve housed animals that could not be released, the permanently injured, the behaviorally unsuited for wild survival, the rare cases where captivity was the most humane option available. She arrived at Evergreen Haven on a cold morning in late March, a tall woman in her 60s with silver gray hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that missed nothing. Professor Thorne had known her for decades, had referred animals to her facility before, but he had never asked for what he was asking now, an evaluation of a situation that defied easy categorization. That required not just expertise, but imagination and understanding. Eleanor spent 3 days at the center, observing Coda and Luna at different times of day, in different situations, taking meticulous notes in a leather-bound journal she carried everywhere. She watched them wake together in the morning, watched Coda groom Luna through the mesh while the kitten purred loudly enough to be heard across the room. She observed their play interactions, Luna batting at Coda's large paws through the barrier while the lynx responded with careful, measured movements, never too rough, always aware of the kitten's fragility. She noted how they ate, how Coda would not touch his own food until Luna had been fed, how he would position himself between her and any perceived threat, how her presence seemed to ease the wild tension that had characterized his early days of captivity. On the evening of her third day, Eleanor sat with Professor Thorne in his office, her journal open on the desk between them. Outside, darkness had fallen, and through the window they could see the snow beginning to fall again, soft flakes drifting through the glow of the security lights. "It's real," Eleanor said without preamble. "What they have is as genuine as any bond I've seen between mother and offspring, between long-mated pairs, between any animals that have formed a deep attachment. Coda has imprinted on Luna as his responsibility, his family, and Luna has bonded with him as her primary attachment figure. They've created a family unit, unconventional certainly, impossible by most definitions, but absolutely authentic." "So you'll take them?" Professor Thorne asked, and he was surprised by the tightness in his own throat. The realization that he had become emotionally invested in this outcome in a way he had not allowed himself to become invested in anything since Margaret's death. "I'll take them," Eleanor confirmed. "We have a large habitat that would be perfect. Originally designed for a pair of cougars that never ended up coming to us. It's spacious, naturalistic, with plenty of vertical space for Coda and cozy spots for Luna. They'll be together, safe, cared for. It's not the wild, but I think for Coda, the wild stopped being home the moment his family died. He's found a new home now, with Luna, and we can give them a place where that home can flourish." The transfer happened on a day in early April when spring was finally beginning to assert itself. the snow retreating to reveal brown earth and the first brave shoots of new growth. Coda and Luna were transported together in a specially modified carrier that allowed them to remain in physical contact. Luna curled against Coda's side. The lynx's large body curved protectively around her. Professor Thorne rode with them in the transport vehicle, unable to quite explain why he needed to make this journey, but knowing somehow that he did. Serene Peak Eternal Preserve was even more beautiful than he remembered. A hidden valley where the forest grew thick and old-growth trees reached towards a sky that seemed wider and bluer than anywhere else. Eleanor met them at the main gate and guided the vehicle to the habitat she had prepared. And when they released Coda and Luna into their new home, Professor Thorne felt something he had not felt in 10 years, a sense of completion, of rightness, of pieces falling into place in a pattern that made sense not to the rational mind, but to the deeper wisdom of the heart. Coda explored the habitat cautiously at first, his injured leg still affecting his gait slightly, but not preventing him from moving with surprising grace. Luna bounded after him, tiny and fearless. And when Coda found a sunny spot beneath a large pine tree, he settled down and allowed Luna to curl up against his warm fur. And they slept together in the spring sunshine as if they had been doing so all their lives. Professor Thorne visited often in the months and years that followed. He would make the drive to Serene Peak on weekends, would spend hours sitting on the bench Eleanor had placed outside Coda and Luna's habitat, watching them live their unconventional but undeniably beautiful life together. He watched Luna grow from a tiny kitten into a sleek white cat with luminous blue eyes and a confident, affectionate personality. He watched Coda settle into a kind of peace, the wild desperation in his eyes gradually replaced by something calmer, something that looked like contentment. He watched, and in watching, he slowly learned to feel again, to allow the walls around his own heart to crumble, to grieve properly for Margaret and then, gradually, to remember her with Derek instead of only pain. Alara joined him on some of these visits, and their friendship deepened into something neither of them quite named but both recognized as important, as healing in its own way. On a warm afternoon in late summer, 5 years after Coda and Luna's arrival at Serene Peak, Professor Thorne sat on his usual bench and watched the two of them, both older now, moving more slowly but still deeply connected, still profoundly devoted to each other. A family approached, parents with 2 young children, and the little girl, perhaps 6 years old, ran up to the habitat fence with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood. "Look, Mommy," she called, "a big kitty and a little kitty. Are they friends?" "They're family," her mother said softly, reading the information plaque mounted beside the habitat. "The lynx's name is Coda, and the white cat is Luna. They saved each other." The little girl pressed her face close to the fence, watching as Coda groomed Luna's fur with his rough tongue while the white cat purred contentedly. "How did they save each other?" she asked. Her father knelt beside her, pointing to the plaque where the story was engraved, simplified for visitors but capturing the essential truth. Coda had lost his family and was very sad. Luna was just a baby and needed someone to take care of her. They found each other when they both needed someone most, and they became a family. Sometimes love happens in unexpected ways. The little girl considered this seriously. "I think that's magic," she said finally. "Yes," Professor Thorne said, speaking up for the first time, and the family turned to look at him, this elderly man with kind eyes who had been sitting so quietly they had not noticed him. "Yes, it is magic, the kind of magic that happens when we choose to care for someone despite our pain. When we open our hearts, even when opening them means risking more loss. Coda and Luna taught me that. They taught me that love is always worth the risk." The little girl smiled at him, then turned back to watch the lynx and the cat, and Professor Thorne sat in the warm sunshine, feeling Margaret's presence not as an absence but as a blessing, as a reminder that he had been capable of deep love once and was capable of it still. The wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like gentle voices, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, and Professor Elias Thorne, who had spent 10 years trying not to feel anything, felt everything, and found that he was strong enough after all to bear the beautiful, terrible weight of being fully alive.